Imagine losing everything you've achieved in a single morning: money, power, status, and discovering that your salvation may come from where you least expect it. Get ready for a journey of redemption, betrayal, and an unexpected bond that will change everything. Want to know how this story ends? Then stay until the end. The city of Boston was dawning under a fine autumn drizzle, but Andrew Carter was already in his office on the 40th floor of the financial district. His fingers drummed impatiently on the mahogany desk as he watched the raindrops drip down the panoramic window. The reflection in the glass showed a man in his 40s, with meticulously combed brown hair and an impeccable Italian suit, the image of the corporate success he had cultivated for 2 decades. "Mr. Carter?" His assistant's voice echoed over the intercom. "The board is meeting in the conference room." Andrew adjusted his navy blue silk tie and picked up his leather briefcase. Every step through the corridors of Carter Investments sounded with the precision of a metronome. Employees looked away as he passed, a habit he interpreted as respect, but which was actually fear. The conference room was silent when he entered. 12 tense faces stared at him, including Michael Brooks, his partner of 15 years. Michael smiled discreetly, a gesture that Andrew couldn't quite decipher. "Gentlemen," Andrew began, his controlled voice filling the room, "the figures for the last quarter." "Andrew," Michael interrupted him, something he had never done before, "I think we need to discuss something more urgent." Michael's smile widened as he slid a folder across the glass table. Andrew opened it slowly, his face remaining impassive as he read the documents. But inside, his stomach was churning. Years of questionable transactions, accounting manipulations and dubious ethical decisions were laid out in meticulous detail. "The board voted this morning," Michael continued, savoring every word. "You are temporarily removed as chairman until an internal investigation is completed." Andrew felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. 15 years of building his empire, sacrificing relationships, ignoring family, dedicating every waking minute to the company, all threatened because of decisions that, at the time, seemed perfectly justifiable in the name of success. "That's ridiculous," Andrew replied, his voice still firm, although his hands were shaking slightly. "Every decision was approved by the board." "You signed half of those documents yourself, Michael." "Yes, but as your junior partner, I just followed your lead." Michael leaned back in his chair. "The board understands that I was manipulated by your position of authority." Andrew looked around the table, searching for allies among those who had agreed with his every decision for years. He found only blank stares and uncomfortable expressions. Years of leading through fear had taken their toll, no one would risk themselves for him now. "You have 1 hour, Andrew said, standing up. 1 hour to drop these charges, or I'm going to take every document, every email, every conversation I've had with each of you over the last 15 years public." "Actually," Michael smiled, "your access has already been revoked. Your corporate email, server, even your badge. Standard protocol in investigative cases." Andrew felt his cell phone vibrate in his pocket. It was a notification from the Boston Globe: "Carter Investments under investigation, CEO removed after allegations of fraud." He left the room without saying another word. Employees whispered as he walked to his office, now with heavy, irregular steps. Within 15 minutes, he had gathered his personal belongings into a cardboard box, a few photos, an Executive of the Year award, an expensive watch he got from his father before he passed away. The rain had intensified when he left the building. Thick drops mingled with the cold sweat running down his forehead. The driver who had served him for years drove straight past when he signaled, pretending not to recognize him. He stopped on the sidewalk, feeling the water soaking his $10,000 suit. A TV in a store window showed his picture, with the headline repeating on a loop: "Scandal hits one of Boston's biggest investment firms." That's when he heard it, a low growl coming from a nearby alley. For a moment, he ignored it, as he had ignored so many things in his life that didn't directly contribute to his success. But something in that sound, perhaps his own newfound vulnerability, made him stop. In the alley, soaking wet and shivering, was a dog. A mongrel with dark fur and expressive eyes that seemed to reflect the same desolation Andrew felt. The animal limped, one front paw raised, and bore the marks of someone who has lived through many battles on the streets. "Go away," Andrew muttered, but his voice failed him. The dog took a step towards him, still keeping its distance, as if it understood that they both needed help, but also had reason to be suspicious. Andrew looked at the building that until that morning had been his empire, at the cardboard box in his arms, and back at the dog. For the first time in years, he didn't have a plan, a strategy, or a calculated way out. For the first time, he was completely lost. The dog came a little closer, its wet tail rehearsing a hesitant movement. And there, in the Boston rain, two broken beings met, unaware that that moment would mark the beginning of a transformation far greater than either of them could have imagined. The penthouse apartment on Beacon Hill, with its privileged view of the Charles River, had never seemed so empty. Andrew walked through the door carrying the soggy cardboard box, followed hesitantly by the dog who, after several minutes of convincing in the alley, decided to accompany him. "I don't know why I brought you here," Andrew muttered, leaving the box on the marble kitchen counter. The dog stood in the doorway, as if it understood that it needed permission to enter that pristine territory. Andrew observed the animal, dark, matted fur, an undefined mix of breeds that suggested a lifetime on the streets. Still, there was a dignity in its bearing, a resilience that Andrew, ironically, envied at that moment. "All right, come in," he sighed, surprised at his own invitation. The dog advanced cautiously, its wet paws leaving marks on the imported wooden floor. In other times, this would have infuriated Andrew. Now, it seemed insignificant. His cell phone kept vibrating, missed calls, messages, social media notifications. The empire he had built was crumbling in real time, and the whole of Boston was watching. He switched off the device and threw it on the sofa. "You need a name," he said to the dog, who was now shyly exploring the room. "Max, simple, straightforward." The animal raised its ears at the sound of the name, as if approving the choice. Andrew went to the bathroom and returned with some towels. He knelt down next to Max and began to dry him awkwardly. His hands, used to signing million-dollar contracts and manipulating complex spreadsheets, were now gently trying to undo the knots in the animal's fur. "This is going to need professional help," he muttered, noticing several bruises under the fur. The paw that Max avoided supporting would also need medical attention. A quick search on her laptop showed a nearby veterinary clinic on Charles Street. "Wait here," said Max, grabbing a dry coat. The dog let out a low, anxious yelp. "I'll be back," Andrew assured him, surprised at his own concern to reassure an animal he barely knew. The rain had subsided by the time he left. The clinic was only a few blocks away, a walk Andrew would normally have made in his imported car. Now he preferred to walk, trying to avoid the looks of recognition from passers-by. The doorbell jingled as he entered the clinic. A woman of about 35, wearing a white coat over simple clothes, was organizing some medical records on the counter. Her brown hair was tied up in an unassuming bun, and there was a natural kindness in her features. "Can I help you?" she asked, raising her eyes. "I found a dog," Andrew began, realizing how strange it sounded in his mouth. He had never found anything in his life, he had always bought or conquered everything. "He's hurt." "Where is he now?" "In my apartment. Not far from here." The woman studied him for a moment. "I'm Clara Moore," she said. "I'm not a veterinarian, I'm actually a nurse at Mass General, but I do volunteer work here in the mornings. Dr. Wilson doesn't arrive until the afternoon, but I can take an initial look if you'd like." Andrew hesitated. In his previous world, he would never have accepted help from anyone other than the most qualified professional available. But something in Clara's sincerity made him nod. "My son Nathan is at school," she continued, picking up a small suitcase. "I have an hour before I need to pick him up. That should be enough for a basic assessment." During the short walk to her apartment, Andrew noticed how Clara walked with purpose, but without the frantic haste he was used to seeing, and demanding, in the corporate world. There was a serenity in her movements that contrasted with the constant tension he carried. "This is it," he said, stopping in front of the luxurious building. Clara showed no impression of the address, something that also surprised him. People usually changed their posture when they realized their social status. When they entered the apartment, Max stood exactly where Andrew had left him, as if he feared that any movement might cause him to lose his new, albeit precarious, situation. "Hey, buddy," Clara approached slowly, crouching down so that she was at the dog's height. Max studied her for a moment before taking a step towards her. "You've had a hard life, haven't you?" she murmured, noticing the old scars mixed in with the fresh bruises. Andrew watched in silence as Clara examined Max with a gentleness that seemed natural. The dog, surprisingly, allowed the examination without resistance. "The paw isn't broken," she concluded. "Probably a sprain. But he has a few cuts that need treatment, and he definitely needs vaccinations and other basic care." "How much?" Andrew began, but stopped. For the first time in his adult life, he needed to think before he spent. His accounts would certainly be frozen as soon as the investigation formally began. Clara noticed his hesitation. "The clinic has a program for rescued animals," she explained. "I can include it when Dr. Wilson arrives. The costs are reduced, and there's an option to pay in installments." Andrew felt his face heat up. The idea of needing financial help was completely alien to him. Nevertheless, he nodded. "You don't have to decide now if you're going to keep him," Clara added, misinterpreting his discomfort. "We can find him a foster home when he's recovered." "No," Andrew replied quickly, surprising himself. "He stays." Clara smiled, a genuine smile that lit up her eyes. "Good. What's his name?" "Max." "Welcome to the family, Max," she said, stroking the dog's head. Then, looking at her watch, "I need to go and pick up Nathan. Come back to the clinic in the afternoon with Max, I'll let Dr. Wilson know about you." When Clara left, Andrew found himself standing in the middle of his luxurious living room, watching Max, who now seemed more relaxed. In less than 24 hours, his world had been turned upside down. He had lost his empire, his reputation, possibly his freedom. And yet, there he was, caring for a street dog and accepting help from a nurse doing voluntary work. Max approached, leaning his muzzle against Andrew's hand. The gesture, so simple and sincere, provoked something he hadn't felt for years, a crack in his carefully constructed armor. For the first time since the disastrous meeting that morning, Andrew Carter allowed himself to feel truly vulnerable. The sound of the television echoed through the apartment as Andrew prepared his third breakfast. The local news presenter was animatedly discussing the latest developments in the Carter affair, as the media had dubbed the scandal. Sources close to the investigation reveal a complex fraud scheme that could exceed $50 million, the reporter announced with barely disguised enthusiasm. Michael Brooks, current interim CEO of Carter Investments, promises full transparency during the investigations. Andrew turned off the TV with an abrupt movement. Max, who was asleep in his new bed in the corner of the room, raised his head, alert to his new owner's sudden outburst of anger. "Sorry, buddy," Andrew muttered, a request that would have sounded absurd to him just a few days ago. He picked up his cell phone, ignoring the dozens of unread messages, and opened the email his lawyer had sent the night before. "Things are not good, Andrew," the text read. "Brooks has presented documents that seem to prove that you acted alone in the questionable operations. He has witnesses willing to confirm that you pressured them to falsify reports. We need to meet urgently." A soft bark brought him back to the present. Max was sitting next to him, his bandaged paw still raised, but his eyes fixed on Andrew with an almost human concern. "It's time for your medicine," Andrew said, consulting the meticulous schedule Clara had prepared after her appointment with Dr. Wilson. Administering medication to a dog was a new experience for someone who barely took care of her own health. The doorbell rang, causing Max to bark defensively. Andrew frowned. Ever since the scandal, he had avoided any social contact. Through the peephole, he saw Clara, accompanied by a boy of about 10. "Sorry to drop by unannounced," she said when he opened the door. Nathan insisted on meeting Max. "We've brought some toys that might help with his recovery." The boy was carrying a paper bag, his eyes shining with anticipation. Andrew hesitated for a moment, his instinct for isolation fighting against something new that was beginning to awaken inside him. "Come in," he finally said, surprising himself with the invitation. Nathan cautiously approached Max, who sniffed the air curiously. "Mommy said he was rescued from the street," the boy commented, taking a rope toy out of the bag. "Like me." Andrew glanced quickly at Clara, who nodded discreetly. "Nathan was adopted as a baby," she explained quietly. "He has a special connection with rescued animals. He thinks they understand each other." Max accepted the toy offered by Nathan, his tail wagging shyly. Soon the two were engaged in a play session, with Nathan laughing at the dog's clumsy attempts to catch the rope with his injured paw. "How are you?" Clara asked Andrew, as they watched the interaction. "I saw the news." He stopped, realizing he didn't know how to complete the sentence. There was no room in his vocabulary for vulnerability or uncertainty. "Surviving," he concluded. "Sometimes that's all we can do," she replied, without judgment. "Nathan and I survived for a long time, until we learned to really live." Andrew's phone vibrated. It was a message from Michael Brooks, "Meeting with investors today. Last chance to confess everything and maybe save some of your assets." "Trouble?" Clara asked, noticing his tense expression. "The man who orchestrated my downfall," Andrew replied, surprised at his own honesty. He's my partner. Someone I trusted for years." "Betrayal hurts more when it comes up close," Clara commented, her eyes momentarily distant. "But sometimes we need to lose something to gain something greater." Andrew observed Nathan and Max, now lying on the carpet, the boy reading a book while the dog rested his head on his lap. The scene contrasted dramatically with the tense meetings and aggressive negotiations that had dominated their mornings until recently. "How do you do it?" he asked suddenly. "How do I do what?" "That. Live. Smile. After everything." He gestured vaguely, not knowing how to express the question he really wanted to ask. Clara smiled, a smile that carried both joy and an understanding of pain. "One day at a time. And with help. No one survives alone, Mr. Carter." "Andrew," he corrected automatically. "Andrew," she repeated. "You know, there's a support group at the community center where I work on Wednesdays. For people who have lost everything. Different stories, same feeling." In other times, Andrew would have rejected the suggestion instantly. Support groups were for weak people, he had always thought. But now, looking at Max and Nathan, at the kindness in Clara's eyes, something inside him hesitated. "Maybe," he replied, surprising himself. The phone vibrated again. Another email from the lawyer. Brooks got access to the personal servers. "He has the conversations with the investors in Asia. We need to act fast." Andrew felt the familiar panic rising in his throat, but then Max got up from the carpet and came over to him, nuzzling his hand. The simple gesture anchored him in the present, reminding him that, for the first time in years, he wasn't completely alone. "Nathan," Clara called out, checking her watch. "We need to go. You have a music lesson in half an hour." The boy hugged Max gently before getting up. "Can I come back another day?" Andrew looked at Clara, who was waiting for his answer with a neutral expression. "Of course," he said, realizing that he really meant yes. "Max will like that." After they left, Andrew sat down on the sofa, Max lying at his feet. On the coffee table, his cell phone kept vibrating with messages and notifications, each one a little time bomb in his professional life. But for the first time since everything fell apart, he allowed himself to ignore them for a moment. One day at a time, right? He murmured to Max, who raised his ears at the sound of his voice. On the Boston skyline, dark clouds loomed, foreshadowing yet another storm. Andrew Carter, the man who used to control every aspect of his life, was discovering that sometimes survival was just a matter of taking a breath and taking the next step, even if he didn't know where it would lead. The Roxbury Community Center looked nothing like the environments Andrew frequented. The red brick building had a worn but welcoming appearance. Colorful posters on the walls advertised art classes, blood drives and various support groups. Andrew stayed in the car for 15 minutes, watching people go in and out of the building. Max, in the passenger seat, looked at him with that expression that seemed to say she understood exactly what he was feeling. "It's ridiculous," Andrew muttered, adjusting his tie for the third time, a habit he still hadn't managed to get rid of, even a week after his departure. "I don't need it." A group of teenagers passed by laughing on the sidewalk. An old lady was feeding pigeons on the steps of the entrance. Everything seemed so normal. So far removed from the chaos that her life had become. Her cell phone vibrated. It was a notification from the Boston Globe. Michael Brooks announces restructuring of Carter Investments, time to clean house. "Let's go, Max," Andrew finally decided, getting out of the car. The dog followed him happily, his paw almost completely recovered. Clara was waiting for him in the driveway, wearing her nurse's uniform. "I thought you weren't coming," she smiled. "The group is about to start. It's on the second floor." The room was simple, chairs arranged in a circle, a table with coffee and cookies in one corner, old windows that let in the late afternoon light. About a dozen people were already seated, chatting quietly. "Guys," Clara called out to the group. "This is Andrew, and that's Max. They're going to accompany us today." Andrew noticed how she didn't mention his surname or any reference to the scandal dominating the headlines. People waved in greeting, some smiling at Max, who was already circling the room, receiving affection. "My name is David," a middle-aged man began. "I lost my machine shop last year. 30 years of work, all to the bank because of an illness in the family." Others began to share their stories. A woman who lost her house in a difficult divorce. A young man who had to close his first business because of the pandemic. Stories of loss, but also of survival. "My dog saved me," a lady called Rose commented, smiling at Max. "After I lost everything, she was the only reason I got out of bed every day." Andrew felt a lump in his throat. Ever since Max had come into his life, he too had a reason to stick to a routine, even on days when everything seemed meaningless. "Do you want to share something, Andrew?" Clara asked gently. He hesitated. In his previous world, vulnerability was synonymous with weakness. But something in that room, in the raw honesty of the stories he had heard, made him speak. "I lost my company," he began, his voice lower than usual. "Someone I trusted, he planned everything for years. Used my own decisions against me." "How are you coping?" David asked. "I'm not," Andrew admitted. "Just existing." If it wasn't for Max, he paused, realizing it was the first time he'd admitted out loud how important the dog had become. His phone vibrated again. This time it was his lawyer. "Brooks is calling a press conference for tomorrow. He has the documents from the Cayman Islands account." Andrew felt his blood run cold. That account was his best-kept secret, an emergency reserve that not even his closest accountants knew about. How had Michael found out? "Is everything all right?" Clara asked, noticing his expression. He began, but was interrupted by Max, who put his head in his lap, looking at him with those eyes that seemed to see through all his defenses. "You know," Rose commented, "when I lost everything, I thought it was the end. But then I realized that everything was relative. I still had my ability to start again, my dignity. Dignity? Andrew laughed bitterly. Tomorrow my name will be all over the headlines again. Everyone will know. Will know what? David interrupted. That you're human. That you've made mistakes. Welcome to the club. The words, spoken without judgment, hit Andrew like a punch. In his obsessive pursuit of success, he had forgotten his own humanity. Now, sitting in a simple room in Roxbury, with a street dog as his best friend, he was being forced to confront her. How did you, he hesitated, searching for the words. How did you move on? One day at a time, Rose replied. And with help. No one has to carry the world alone. After the meeting, as people were saying goodbye, Clara approached. Nathan asked if he could visit Max at the weekend. Andrew nodded, surprised at how much the idea appealed to him. Of course. Maybe we can take Max to the park. He needs to exercise more, according to Dr. Wilson. Clara smiled. Nathan would love that. On the way home, Andrew drove in silence, processing everything he had heard. Max slept in the seat next to him, occasionally stirring in his doggy dreams. His cell phone rang again. It was Michael Brooks. Last chance, Andrew, the familiar voice sounded cold on the other end. Tomorrow I'm going to reveal everything. Unless you take all the blame publicly. We can make a deal. Andrew looked at Max at the community center disappearing in the rearview mirror, thought about Clara, Nathan, the people he had met today. For the first time in his life, he felt he had something more important than money or power to protect, his newfound humanity. No, he answered simply, and hung up. Night fell over Boston when Andrew arrived home. On the horizon, the lights of the skyscrapers were beginning to come on, including the Carter Investments building. But for the first time since it all began, he didn't feel that sharp pain at the sight of his former empire. Instead, he scratched behind Max's ears and murmured, "One day at a time, buddy. One day at a time." Michael Brooks' press conference dominated all the local news that morning. Andrew watched, sitting on the floor of his apartment, with Max sleeping next to him. On the screen, his ex-partner, impeccable in an Italian suit that Andrew recognized as his gift from last Christmas, fired the last bullet in his reputation. "It is with deep regret that I confirm the existence of a secret account in the Cayman Islands," Michael announced, his voice laden with false sadness. "Documents show regular transfers of embezzled funds from investors to this personal account of Mr. Carter." Max raised his head, sensing Andrew's growing tension. The dog moved closer, leaning against his arm in a gesture of silent comfort. The phone rang. It was his lawyer. "This is very bad, Andrew," the voice sounded tense on the other end. "The SEC is involved now. They're going to freeze all your accounts. We need." A loud knock on the door interrupted the conversation. Through the peephole, Andrew saw two men in suits, flashing badges. "Mr. Carter. FBI. We need you to come with us." Max started barking, putting himself between Andrew and the door. For a moment, Andrew considered not opening it, running down the fire escape, disappearing. But then he remembered the words he had heard in the support group, dignity. "Calm down, Max," he murmured, opening the door. "It's going to be all right." The agents were professional but firm. While one read out his rights, the other watched Max, who continued to bark defensively. "The dog." Andrew began, genuine concern in his voice. "I can look after him," a familiar voice sounded from the hallway. Clara was there, still in her nurse's uniform. "I saw the news, I figured something like this might happen. Nathan will love having Max for a few days." Andrew felt a lump in his throat. It was the first time in his adult life that someone had anticipated his needs without expecting anything in return. "Thanks," he managed to say, as the officers handcuffed him. "Max, go with her. Be a good boy." The dog looked between Andrew and Clara, clearly distressed. Clara approached him gently, stroking his ears. "He'll come back, Max," she promised, both to the dog and to Andrew. In the elevator, going down with the agents, Andrew thought about how his life had changed. A few weeks ago, his biggest concern was the value of the company's shares. Now, his heart ached at the thought of a street dog that had become his only family. Outside the building, a crowd of reporters was waiting. Flashes went off, questions were shouted, microphones pushed in their direction. Andrew held his head high, but not with the pride that used to define him. It was something different now, that dignity Rose had spoken of. "Mr. Carter. How do you respond to the accusations? What do you say about the account in the Cayman Islands? What's your answer to Michael Brooks?" Suddenly, a loud bark cut through the air. Max had escaped from the apartment and was running down the stairs towards her. Clara was right behind him, panting. "Max, no!" Andrew shouted, seeing the dog rapidly approaching. But Max wasn't attacking anyone. He simply sat down next to Andrew, looking at the reporters as if daring them to hurt his owner. The scene made the cameras go off even more frantically. "I need to take you, Mr. Carter," one of the officers said gently. Andrew knelt down, with difficulty due to the handcuffs, so that he was at Max's height. "It's going to be okay, buddy. Clara will take care of you. And I'll be back, I promise." The dog's eyes, the same eyes that had captivated him in that rainy alley, seemed to understand every word. Max licked his face once, a farewell gesture that made Andrew swallow. "Take care of him," Andrew asked Clara, who nodded, tears in her eyes. In the FBI car, crossing the streets of Boston, Andrew observed the city that had been his private kingdom for so long. They passed through the financial district, where the Carter Investments building stood imposingly. In the lobby, he could see Michael Brooks giving another interview, savoring his moment of triumph. But strangely, Andrew no longer felt that consuming anger. Instead, he felt a clarity he had never experienced before. He had lost his empire, his fortune, his freedom. But for the first time in decades, he had something real: Max's unconditional loyalty, Clara's unpretentious kindness, Nathan's innocence, the raw honesty of the support group. At the police station, during the filing process, the officer in charge commented, "I've never seen a dog do anything like this before. They usually run away when there's trouble." Andrew allowed himself a small smile. "Max is no ordinary dog." "None are," the agent replied, surprisingly. "They see something in us that sometimes we don't even see ourselves." That night, in his temporary cell, Andrew Carter, former CEO, now accused of financial fraud, did something he hadn't done since he was a child: he prayed. Not for his freedom or to recover his fortune, but for something simpler and infinitely more valuable: the chance to be the man Max thought he was. Across town, in a modest apartment in Roxbury, Max slept at the foot of Nathan's bed, reading stories to the dog. Clara watched from the doorway, thinking about how sometimes the greatest lessons in loyalty and love came from the most unexpected places. And in his luxurious office, Michael Brooks contemplated his victory, without realizing that he had lost something much more valuable than money or power: his humanity. The same humanity that Andrew Carter, ironically, was rediscovering in a prison cell, thanks to a street dog and people who still believed in second chances. The cell at Plymouth Federal Penitentiary was a far cry from the luxurious penthouses Andrew was used to. A narrow bed, a metal sink, a small window that offered a limited view of the gray Massachusetts sky. For the first few nights, the silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional sounds of doors closing and guards' footsteps in the corridors. "Carter, visit," announced a guard on the morning of the third day. Andrew expected to see his lawyer, but who appeared on the other side of the glass was David, the mechanic from the support group. The man picked up the phone from the booth with natural ease, as if visiting ex-COS in prison was part of his routine. "Rose sent cookies," David said, after the initial greetings. "But they wouldn't let you in." Regulations. How did you know I was here? Clara told us in the group. Max is fine, by the way. Nathan doesn't leave the dog alone for a minute. Andrew felt a tightness in his chest at the thought of Max. Thanks for coming, he said, surprised at his own sincerity. You know, David continued, I lost my workshop because of a similar scam. A partner forged my signature on loans, embezzled the money. By the time I found out, it was too late. What did you do? I survived. I rebuilt. Today I have a smaller workshop, but it's honest. And I sleep peacefully. The conversation was interrupted by another guard announcing the end of visiting hours. Before leaving, David left a note with the number of his new workshop. For when I leave here, he explained. I always need someone good with numbers. That night, lying in his bed, Andrew reflected on how his life had changed. The man who once despised ordinary people now found comfort in the sincere solidarity of a mechanic. His lawyer turned up the next day, carrying a thick folder of documents. I've got news, he began, spreading papers out on the boardroom table. I've been investigating Brooks' movements over the last few years. Something didn't add up. Andrew looked at the spreadsheets and reports, his finance-trained mind quickly spotting patterns. See that? The lawyer pointed to a series of transfers. Brooks started preparing his move 3 years ago, when he opened a shell company in the British Virgin Islands. Phoenix Global Holdings, Andrew read the name. Never heard of it. Exactly. But look at the dates of the transfers from his account in the Cayman Islands. Andrew studied the figures, feeling his stomach turn. They started after Phoenix was created. Brooks hacked your personal accesses, the lawyer explained. He didn't just discover your secret account, he used it to create a false trail of evidence against you. But why? He was already a partner, he already had power in the company. Because Carter Investments was just the beginning. Brooks is negotiating a merger with Goldman Sachs. But they'd never go for it with you in charge. Your tough guy reputation annoyed the more conservative investors. Andrew leaned back in his chair, memories of the last few years flashing through his mind. Michael's subtle suggestions for more aggressive decisions, the casual meetings with Goldman executives, the comments about how Andrew should soften his image. He manipulated me, Andrew muttered. He made me look more and more ruthless while presenting himself as the voice of reason. And it worked perfectly, the lawyer agreed. Now he's seen as the ethical leader who exposed corruption. The perfect man to lead the merger. A guard interrupted the meeting, announcing another visitor. To Andrew's surprise, it was Clara. Sorry to barge in on you like this, she said after the lawyer had left, but something's happened that you need to know about. She took her cell phone out of her pocket and showed him a video. It was from the security camera at the park where she took Max and Nathan for a walk. In the video, a man in a suit was watching the boy play with his dog, discreetly taking photos. I've started to notice him over the last few days, Clara explained. Today, Nathan said that the same man appeared near the school. Andrew felt a chill run down his spine. Can you get a clearer picture of him? Clara zoomed in on the video. The man was Ryan Weber, head of security at Carter Investments, and Michael Brooks' right-hand man. He's watching Max, Andrew realized. Brooks must think there's something incriminating in the apartment, something I've entrusted to the dog. Clara frowned. That's crazy. Max is just a dog. Brooks doesn't think so. He knows me, or thinks he does. He knows I'd never trust people, but maybe he'd trust an animal. What do we do? Andrew thought for a moment. Do you still have the key to my apartment? Clara nodded. There's a false folder at the bottom of the second drawer in the office. Documents that look important, but aren't. Brooks will send someone to look for them. Let them find it. What about the real documents? They never existed, Andrew smiled slightly. That was the beauty of his plan, to create evidence where there was none. Clara studied his face for a moment. "You look different," she observed. "What do you mean?" "More human." Andrew thought of Max, of Nathan, of the support group, of David offering a job to a man who once wouldn't have spoken to him. "Maybe I needed to lose everything to find something more important," he replied. That evening, in his cell, Andrew received one last visitor, a guard delivering mail. It was a drawing of Nathan, Max lying on his bed, with a simple message written in childish handwriting: "He's waiting for you to come back." Andrew pasted the drawing on the wall next to his bed. Outside, the Plymouth night was clear, stars shining through the small window. Somewhere in Boston, Michael Brooks was celebrating his apparent victory, unaware that his own greed had sown the seeds of his destruction. And in a modest apartment in Roxbury, Max slept at the foot of Nathan's bed, protecting the boy who protected him, while Clara organized her notes on Ryan Webber's suspicious movements. The truth, like an underground river, was beginning to find its way to the surface. The night on Beacon Hill was exceptionally quiet when two shadows moved down the corridor of the luxurious building. Ryan Webber, accompanied by another man, used a master key to open the door to Andrew Carter's apartment. 15 minutes, Webber whispered. "Brooks wants those documents before the meeting with Goldman tomorrow." What they didn't expect was to find Max there. Clara had decided to bring the dog back to the apartment that night, worried that the change of environment was affecting his recovery process. Max, lying on the sofa, raised his head at the first sign of an invasion. Years on the streets had sharpened his instincts. His low growl was the only warning the intruders received. "Damn, the dog shouldn't be here," Webber cursed, taking a step back. Max advanced slowly, his body tense, ready to protect his master's territory. Webber pulled out a small tranquilizer gun, but before he could use it, a noise from the corridor distracted him. "Max? Are you awake?" It was Nathan's voice. The boy had insisted on sleeping in the apartment with the dog, and Clara, after much reluctance, had agreed, planning to get some changes of clothes from home and return. Webber signaled for his companion to hide, but Max was already in action. The dog dashed towards the bedroom door, barking furiously to alert Nathan. "What's going on?" Nathan asked sleepily, appearing in the doorway. His eyes widened at the sight of the strangers. "Kid, go back to your room," Webber ordered, his voice tense. Max positioned himself between Nathan and the invaders, his barking now more aggressive. The boy, frightened but maintaining the surprising calm that children sometimes show in dangerous situations, began to back away slowly. "Max, come," he called, remembering what his mother always said about dangerous situations. "Get the kid," Webber ordered his companion. "We can't leave any witnesses." The other man advanced, but Max was faster. Years of survival on the streets had taught the dog exactly where to attack. His teeth closed on the attacker's leg, who screamed in pain. Nathan ran into the bedroom, locked the door and did exactly what Clara had always instructed him to do: he called 911. Webber, realizing that the situation was getting out of hand, pointed the tranquilizer at Max. But the dog moved quickly, years of life on the streets making his movements unpredictable. Mrs. Moore, the voice of Alfred, the night porter, sounded through the apartment's intercom. "Is everything all right?" "I heard barking." Webber cursed softly. The plan was falling apart fast. "Let's go," he ordered his partner, who was visibly limping. But Max wouldn't allow him to escape so easily. The dog blocked the door, growling menacingly. The sound of sirens began to echo in the distance. "Shoot that damn dog," his partner shouted. Webber took aim, but before he could pull the trigger, the apartment door opened violently. Clara was there, accompanied by two policemen. On the floor. "Now," the officers ordered, guns drawn. Webber and his companion had no choice. While they were handcuffed, Clara ran into the bedroom where Nathan was locked. "My love. Is everything all right?" "Mom." Nathan opened the door, throwing himself into her arms. Max protected us. He was amazing. The dog, still alert but calmer, approached the boy, checking him over as if to make sure he was unharmed. Clara hugged them both, tears in her eyes. At the police station, hours later, Weber began to talk. The pressure of a possible charge of attempted child abduction was more than he could bear. Brooks is obsessed, he confessed. The merger with Goldman is almost closed, but he's sure that Carter hid documents that could ruin him. He's convinced he trusted the dog with something. The dog? The detective asked, skeptical. Brooks has known Carter for years. He says he's never trusted anyone, he's always been paranoid about documents. But after he got that mutt. Brooks thinks he's changed, that he may have left clues. At the prison, Andrew received news of the night's events from Clara, who had arranged an emergency visit. Max and Nathan are fine, she assured him. The dog wouldn't let anyone near the boy. Andrew closed his eyes, a wave of emotions overwhelming him. I'm sorry, he whispered. You should never have been involved in this. Max chose to get involved the moment he decided to trust you in that alley, Clara replied. And we chose when we decided to trust Max. Weber is talking, she continued. The police are interested in Brooks' obsession with documents that apparently don't exist. They think there might be more behind it. Andrew thought for a moment. Maybe there is. Brooks has always been too meticulous, too controlling. This merger story, there's something that doesn't fit. What do you mean? He didn't have to destroy me to make the merger happen. He could have gradually removed me, bought my shares. Unless. Andrew stopped, a realization hitting him. Unless the merger is just a front for something bigger. Clara, I need you to take something to my lawyer. A list of all the shell companies Brooks has created in the last 5 years. Phoenix Global Holdings was just the beginning. That night, in her apartment now guarded by police officers, Clara watched Nathan sleep, Max faithfully by her side. The dog had refused to leave the boy's room, keeping his protective vigil. And in his cell, Andrew Carter smiled slightly, thinking about how a street mutt had not only changed his heart, but possibly saved his reputation. Brooks' obsession with searching for non-existent documents had exposed his own paranoia, and with it, the first cracks in his careful facade were beginning to show. Good boy, Max, he muttered into the silence of the night. Good boy. Clara Moore always followed the same routine when she left the hospital, put her uniform away in her locker, exchanged messages with the nanny who looked after Nathan after school, and walked to the subway. But that night, something was different. The empty corridors of Massachusetts General Hospital seemed darker than usual. While organizing her belongings, a folder fell out of her bag, documents that Andrew's lawyer had gathered about Michael Brooks' shell companies. She had spent her lunch hour studying them, looking for connections that might help Andrew. Working late, Clara? The voice made her freeze. Michael Brooks was standing in the doorway of the changing room, his cordial smile not reaching his eyes. Mr. Brooks, she replied, keeping her voice steady as she discreetly slid her briefcase into the locker. What are you doing here? I came to make a donation to the hospital, he replied, stepping closer. Part of our social responsibility program. Interesting to find you here. Clara closed the cupboard, very aware that she was alone with the man who had destroyed Andrew's life and tried to hurt her son. You know, Brooks continued, I've always wondered why a dedicated nurse would get involved with someone like Andrew Carter. I didn't get involved with anyone, Clara replied. I just helped someone who needed it. Brooks laughed, a humorless sound. You did? Like you helped your ex-husband? Clara felt her blood run cold. No one in Boston knew about her past in Chicago, about the traumatic divorce that had made her start over from scratch with Nathan. I've done my research, Clara, Brooks continued. I know about the charges your ex-husband faced, about how you testified against him. Fascinating how you always get involved with troubled men. What do you want? The documents you're hiding. I know Carter trusted you with something. Perhaps through that ridiculous dog, perhaps directly. Hand them over, and your past remains in the past. Clara straightened her shoulders, years of confrontation with her abusive ex-husband giving her strength. There are no documents, Mr. Brooks. And unlike my ex-husband, Andrew is innocent. You should know, you fabricated the evidence. Brooks' smile disappeared. Careful, Clara. Nathan is a lovely child. It would be terrible if social services found out about your past, questioned your ability as a mother. Before Clara could reply, voices echoed in the corridor. Brooks stepped back, his professional smile returning to his face. Think about what I said, he muttered before leaving. Hands shaking, Clara picked up her cell phone and dialed the first number that came to mind, David, from the support group. I need you to pick Nathan up from school, she said as soon as he answered. And take Max with you. I don't trust anyone else right now. Meanwhile, in prison, Andrew received an unexpected visitor, a man he hadn't seen for years, William Chen, a former Goldman Sachs executive. You were right, Chen said without preamble. The merger is a facade. Brooks isn't negotiating with Goldman, he's negotiating with Brightline Capital. Brightline? The investment fund that. Which went bust in 2008, exactly. Or rather, which everyone thought had gone bust. Andrew felt the pieces falling into place. Brooks is using Goldman's reputation as a smokescreen while he prepares something with Brightline. Worse, Chen continued. We've discovered that Phoenix Global Holdings has connections to former Brightline accounts in the Cayman Islands. The same accounts you investigated in 2008. Andrew closed his eyes, memories of that time returning. He had uncovered irregularities in Brightline's operations, but before he could expose everything, the fund declared bankruptcy, its executives disappeared, and thousands of investors lost everything. Brooks was there, Andrew muttered. He was a junior analyst at the time, he worked on Brightline's audit. Exactly. And now, 15 years later, he's about to use Carter Investments as a vehicle to resurrect the scheme. The merger with Goldman is just to give the operation legitimacy. On the other side of town, Clara arrived at Andrew's lawyer's office, still shaken by her meeting with Brooks. But as she entered the room, she realized that something was wrong. Drawers open, papers strewn about, clear signs of a break-in. Her cell phone rang, it was David. Nathan's with me, he assured him. Max won't let anyone near the boy. But Clara, there's something you need to see on the news. She turned on the office television. Michael Brooks was giving another press conference. It is with deep sadness that I announce that the investigations have uncovered an even bigger scam, he announced. Andrew Carter did not act alone. We discovered that a hospital employee, Clara Moore, helped hide documents and facilitated fraudulent operations. Clara felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. In a matter of hours, Brooks had turned her life into a nightmare, just as her ex-husband had done years ago. Her cell phone rang again. It was an unknown number. Ms. Moore, a female voice asked. This is Rebecca Martinez, from the federal prosecutor's office. We need you to come to our office immediately. Clara looked out of the office window. Outside, reporters were already starting to gather. Her past in Chicago, which she had guarded so carefully, was about to come to light. But this time it would be different. This time, she wasn't alone. I'll be there in 20 minutes, she replied, her voice firm. At home, Nathan was playing with Max, oblivious to the chaos. The dog, however, was restless, his instincts warning him that something was wrong. He stood between the boy and the door, ready to protect him again if necessary. And in prison, Andrew Carter did something he hadn't done since taking over as CEO, he asked for help. One by one, he called old contacts, people who knew the truth about Brightline Capital. The real battle was just beginning, and this time it wasn't about money or power, it was about justice, loyalty and redemption. The federal prosecutor's office in Boston was a maze of silent corridors and closed doors. Clara followed Prosecutor Rebecca Martinez into a conference room where 3 other investigators were waiting. On the table, a thick folder labeled, "Moore, Clara, Chicago, 2019, seemed to scream into silence. "Ms. Moore," Martinez began, "before we discuss Mr. Brooks' charges, we need to understand your background in Chicago." Clara took a deep breath, her hands intertwined on the table to disguise her trembling. "My ex-husband, Robert Wilson, was the CFO of a hospital in Chicago. In 2019, I discovered that he was embezzling funds intended for the treatment of children with cancer." "And you reported him," Martinez added, looking through the files. "Yes. He threatened to take Nathan away from me, said that no one would believe a nurse against a CFO. But I had proof. Documents, recordings. The same kind of evidence Michael Brooks claims you have against Andrew Carter." Clara looked up, a new strength in her voice. "The difference is that Robert was guilty. Andrew is innocent." At that same moment, William Chen entered the prison for another visit to Andrew. His normally calm face showed an unusual agitation. "We found something," he said, spreading documents out on the table. "Brooks wasn't just working on the Brightline audit in 2008. He was responsible for hiding the evidence of fraud." Andrew examined the papers. "How did you manage that?" "His former secretary, Patricia. She kept copies of everything for the last 15 years. She said she never fully trusted Brooks." A guard interrupted the conversation, bringing in more visitors, David and Nathan, with Max anxiously pulling the tab. "Sorry to barge in like this," David said, "but the boy needed to see you." "And Max?" "Well, he hasn't eaten properly since Clara went to the prosecutor's office." Max ran over to Andrew, ignoring the guard's protests. The dog rested his front paws on his master's lap, his eyes conveying an almost human concern. "It's okay, buddy," Andrew murmured, stroking Max's ears. "We'll protect Clara, I promise." Nathan approached timidly. "Mr. Carter. Mom's been crying at night. She thinks I don't listen, but..." Andrew felt his heart squeeze. "Nathan, your mother is the strongest person I know. And do you know why? Because she always does the right thing, even when it's hard. Like when she helped Max." "Exactly. And now it's our turn to help her." William Chen watched the scene with interest. "Carter, have you noticed that Brooks is repeating the same pattern? In 2008, he destroyed evidence to protect corrupt executives. Now, he's fabricating evidence to destroy honest people. The difference," Andrew replied, "is that this time he's chosen the wrong victims." At the prosecutor's office, Clara continued her testimony. "After Robert was arrested, he had friends who started harassing me. I had to move to another city, start again from scratch. Nathan was too small to understand, but now he's not," Martinez added softly. "And Brooks is using that against you. He thinks he can scare me like Robert did," Clara said, her voice gaining strength. "But there's one crucial difference, this time I'm not alone." Martinez studied Clara for a long moment before picking up another file. "We received this an hour ago. Bank transfer records linking Brooks to old Brightline Capital accounts. He was trying to resurrect a fraud scheme from 15 years ago. And he needed to get Andrew out of the way," Clara added, the pieces falling into place. "Exactly. Carter was known for his diligence in audits. He would have discovered the connection eventually." At the prison, William Chen made one last revelation. "Brooks set up a meeting with the supposed Goldman representatives for tomorrow. But we found out that they're actually Brightline executives using false identities." "The final trap," Andrew muttered. "He's going to use the meeting to transfer control of Carter Investments to Brightline, all under the guise of a legitimate merger with Goldman. Max, who had been quiet until then, started barking agitatedly. Nathan, who was playing with the dog, noticed something falling from his collar, a small recording device. "What's this?" David picked up the device. Andrew examined the device. Brooks wasn't looking for documents in the apartment. He was planting bugs. He wanted to monitor my conversations with Clara through Max. "But that means—" William Chin began. "That he recorded his own confession in the hospital," Andrew added. "When he threatened Clara, Max was there." At the prosecutor's office, Martinez was receiving an urgent call. His face changed expression as he listened. "Ms. Moore," she said after hanging up, "I think we have enough evidence not only to clear your name, but to arrest Michael Brooks." Clara felt tears well up in her eyes. "Nathan. He's safe. And so are you." Outside the prosecutor's office, reporters waited anxiously. But this time, when Clara came out, she wasn't alone. Rebecca Martinez walked beside her, as federal agents made their way to the Carter Investments building. In his office, Michael Brooks watched the agents move through the window. His cell phone rang. It was a blocked number. "It's over, Michael," Andrew's voice sounded clear. "Max recorded everything." Brooks laughed bitterly. "A mongrel dog. I was destroyed by a fucking mongrel dog." "No," Andrew corrected. "You were destroyed by your own arrogance. Max just showed us the way." While federal agents raided Brooks' office, Clara arrived at the prison with Nathan. Max, who had never left Andrew's side during the visit, ran to greet them, his tail wagging with a joy that seemed to perfectly understand the magnitude of the moment. "Is it over?" Nathan asked, hugging his mother. Clara looked at Andrew, at Max, at the people who had become her unlikely family. "No, my love. It's just beginning." The morning that Michael Brooks was due to be arrested dawned with a dense fog covering Boston. Federal agents discreetly surrounded the Carter Investments building as employees began arriving for another day's work. On the 40th floor, Brooks watched the city through the same panoramic window where, not so long ago, Andrew used to contemplate his empire. His cell phone was ringing incessantly, executives from Brightline Capital demanding explanations about the cancellation of the meeting scheduled for that day. Mr. Brooks, his new assistant, called over the intercom. "Federal agents are on their way up." Brooks hung up the intercom and picked up a folder from his desk, the only one that hadn't been scanned or copied. Inside were documents that could incriminate not only Brightline executives, but judges, politicians and influential businessmen. His real-life insurance. The private elevator in his office, an extravagance that Andrew had always considered unnecessary, led straight to the garage. Brooks smiled at the thought that the same ostentation he had criticized so much in his former partner could now save him. At the prison, Andrew was visited by his lawyer and prosecutor Martinez. "Brooks has escaped," Martinez announced bluntly. "But we have agents at all the airports and stations." "He's not going to try to leave the city," Andrew replied thoughtfully. "Not yet. He has one last move to make." "How can you be sure?" "Because I know him. Michael has always been obsessed with chess. He wouldn't leave without trying one last checkmate." In Clara's apartment, Max suddenly started barking at the window. Nathan, who was playing with the dog, went over to see what had caught his attention. "Mom," he shouted. "The bad man is downstairs." Clara ran to the window. Michael Brooks was standing on the other side of the street, looking directly into her apartment. When their gazes met, he held up a phone, signaling for her to pick it up. "What do you want?" Clara asked as soon as his cell phone rang. "An exchange," Brooks replied. "I have documents that could free Andrew immediately. But I need a safe route out of the country." "Why would I believe you?" "Because you're like me, Clara. You know the power of secrets. In Chicago, you used Robert's secrets to destroy him. Now I offer you the same power. Clara felt a chill when she heard her ex-husband's name. You don't know me, Michael. I exposed Robert because it was the right thing to do, not for power. Noble, Brooks laughed. But what if I told you that these documents could also destroy people who hurt you in Chicago? Friends of Robert's who made your life hell. Clara looked at Nathan, who was hugging Max protectively. The dog kept his eyes fixed on the window, a low growl in his throat. Meet me at the abandoned pier in an hour, Brooks continued. Come alone. What if I notify the police? Then the documents disappear, and Andrew rots in prison. The call ended. Clara immediately called Martinez, putting the phone on speaker while packing a backpack. He's desperate, Martinez commented after hearing the report. That makes him even more dangerous. But also careless, Clara replied. He didn't realize that Max was wearing a new GPS collar, a present from Nathan. In the prison, Andrew listened to the conversation with growing concern. Clara, don't go. It's too dangerous. I have to go. But not alone. She looked at Max, who was already at her side, alert and ready. Brooks never understood that true loyalty can't be bought or blackmailed. The abandoned pier was a remnant of old industrial Boston, with empty warehouses and decaying docks. Clara parked her car where Brooks had indicated, Max silently at her side. You came, Brooks emerged from the shadows of a warehouse. And you brought the dog. Predictable. The documents, Clara demanded. Brooks held up the folder. First, my safe exit. Why, Michael? Why destroy Andrew, threaten a child? Because people like Andrew and you are weak, he replied with contempt. All this talk about doing the right thing, about loyalty, the world doesn't work like that. No, a voice sounded behind him. That's exactly how the world works. Rebecca Martinez emerged with a team of agents, their guns drawn. Brooks looked around, realizing he was surrounded. The GPS on the collar, he muttered, finally understanding. The bloody dog again. Actually, Clara smiled, it was Nathan's idea. He said Max needed a collar to match his work as a hero. Brooks made a sudden move towards Clara, but Max was quicker. The dog didn't attack, it just positioned itself between them, its low growl carrying the weight of years on the streets, of instinctive protection, of true loyalty. Michael Brooks, Martinez announced formally, you are under arrest for fraud, extortion, and attempted obstruction of justice. As the agents handcuffed Brooks, Clara picked up the briefcase lying on the floor. Inside were all the documents that proved not only Andrew's innocence, but a conspiracy that spanned decades. In prison, Andrew received the news of Brooks' arrest with an emotion he couldn't name. It wasn't revenge, or even satisfaction. It was something closer to peace. Mr. Carter, the guard called out, you have one more visitor. Nathan ran in, followed by Clara and Max. The boy carried something in his hands, the GPS collar that had helped capture Brooks. Look, Mr. Carter. The hero's collar worked. Andrew knelt down so that he was at the boy's height. You know, Nathan, the real hero isn't the collar. It's people like you and your mom, who do the right thing even when it's hard. Max rested his head on Andrew's shoulder, and for a moment, everyone was silent, absorbing the magnitude of what they had achieved together. Outside, the fog was beginning to clear, revealing a different Boston from the one Andrew used to observe from the top of his empire. It was a city where second chances were possible, where loyalty still meant something, and where even a fallen CEO could learn the most important lessons of his life from a mongrel dog. The Boston federal courtroom was packed on the morning of Andrew Carter's final hearing. Reporters occupied most of the seats, eager to document the outcome of one of the biggest financial scandals in the city's recent history. But in the front row, an unusual group caught the eye, a nurse, a 10-year-old boy, a mechanic, and a dog with a special service collar. The court recognizes that the evidence presented by the prosecution clearly demonstrates that Andrew Carter was the victim of an elaborate conspiracy, Judge Henderson stated. All charges against him are dismissed, and his release should be processed immediately. The sound of the judicial gavel echoed through the room, officially marking the end of a nightmare that had lasted months. Andrew, wearing a suit that David had borrowed for the occasion, felt something warm run down his face. They were tears, the first he had allowed himself to shed in public since childhood. Max, who had been given special permission to be in court as an emotional support dog, an idea of Clara's that the judge surprisingly accepted, approached Andrew, nuzzling his hand. The gesture, so similar to their first meeting in that rainy alley, seemed to close a circle. "Welcome back," Clara whispered, as Nathan jumped for joy beside her. Outside the courthouse, a crowd of reporters was waiting. But before they could reach Andrew, a familiar figure made his way through them. Mr. Carter, Patricia, his former secretary, approached with tears in her eyes. "The staff, we're all waiting in the office. If you want to come back." Andrew looked at the Carter Investments building, visible in the distance. For so long, that building had been the symbol of everything he valued: power, success, control. Now, it seemed strangely small. "Patty," he smiled, using the nickname he had never allowed himself to use before, "I think it's time to do things differently." The next day, Andrew called a meeting not in the boardroom, but in the main auditorium, where all the staff could attend. Max accompanied him, now officially registered as the company's therapy dog, another of Clara's suggestions that initially seemed absurd, but made perfect sense in her new world. "Carter Investments has always been known for its financial success," he began, "but I found out the hard way that there are more valuable things than numbers on a spreadsheet." He announced a series of changes: a profit-sharing program for all employees, an on-site daycare center, flexible hours for fathers and mothers, and a new division dedicated to social investments. "And one more thing," he added, signaling Clara to join him on stage. "I'm proud to announce our new Director of Social Responsibility, Clara Moore, who will oversee our partnership with local hospitals and community programs." Clara, who had hesitated to accept the position, smiled as she saw the enthusiastic reaction of the employees. Nathan, sitting in the front row with Max, applauded loudest of all. Later that day, Andrew did something he had never done in his years as CEO. He walked around the different departments, meeting people who had always worked for him, but with whom he had never really spoken. Max accompanied him, his presence breaking the ice and facilitating conversations that had previously seemed impossible. At the end of the afternoon, he had one last stop to make. David's workshop was small, but immaculately organized. The mechanic was under a car when Andrew arrived. "Is that job offer still on?" Andrew asked, causing David to roll out of the car with a surprised look on his face. "I thought you had a company to run." "I do. But I also have a lot to learn about how things really work. How about a deal? I help with your bookkeeping at weekends, and you teach me basic mechanics." David wiped his hands on his overalls, studying Andrew for a moment. "You know you're going to get that Italian suit dirty, don't you?" "Actually," Andrew smiled, taking off his jacket, "I think it's about time for some closet changes too." In the evening, in his apartment, Andrew made another significant change. The expensive works of art and furniture chosen by decorators gave way to something more personal: photos of the support group, Nathan's drawings, and a comfortable bed for Max next to his own. Clara and Nathan came over for a celebratory dinner, pizza on the sofa, something the former Andrew Carter would have considered unthinkable. As Nathan excitedly recounted his day at school, with Max lying at his feet, Andrew realized that he had found something his money could never buy: a family. "What are you thinking about?" Clara asked, noticing his distant gaze. "How ironic life is," he replied. "I spent years building walls to protect myself, denying any vulnerability. And it was precisely when I lost everything, when I found myself most vulnerable, that I found my true strength." "And what is that strength?" Andrew looked at Nathan teaching Max tricks, at the simpler but infinitely more welcoming apartment, at the woman who had helped him rediscover his humanity. Connection, he answered simply. The courage to trust, to care, to be real. That evening, after Clara and Nathan had left, Andrew sat on his balcony with Max. The city shone under the night sky, but he no longer felt the need to possess or control it. Instead, he felt part of it, not like a king in his tower, but as one more of its inhabitants, connected to its community in ways he had never imagined possible. You know, Max, he murmured, scratching the dog's ears, I think I've finally understood what you've been trying to teach me since that first day in the rain. Max raised his head, his expressive eyes fixed on Andrew. Sometimes you have to lose yourself completely to really find yourself. 1 year can change everything. The Roxbury Community Center, once worn and plain, now sported a renovated facade, with a well-kept garden and a new sign, Cartermore Community Development and Support Center. On the lawn in front of the building, white chairs were arranged in rows, occupied by an eclectic mix of people, executives in expensive suits next to mechanics in jeans, nurses still in uniform after their shifts, neighborhood residents and, of course, several rescued dogs. Max, wearing a special bow tie for the occasion, was sitting proudly next to Nathan, who had grown a few centimeters in the last year. The dog occasionally glanced at Andrew, who was waiting nervously at the small makeshift altar, adjusting the sleeve of his shirt, not an Italian suit this time, but a simple, elegant shirt chosen by Clara. Breathe, David whispered, fulfilling his role as best man. His hands, always so steady when fixing engines, now held the small box with the rings. Music began to play, not the traditional wedding march, but an acoustic version of What a Wonderful World. Clara emerged at the beginning of the aisle, radiant in a simple, elegant dress, led by Nathan, who took the task of handing over his mother with adorable seriousness. As Clara walked towards him, Andrew reflected on the past year. Carter Investments had been completely transformed. The social investment program, led by Clara, had already helped renovate 3 public hospitals and established a support network for local small business owners. David's workshop, now part of a professional training program funded by the company, trained young mechanics from the neighborhood. But the biggest changes had happened in the small moments, on Saturday mornings when he and Nathan fixed cars with David, on evenings of pizza and board games, on daily walks with Max through the park. The man who once measured success in millions now found it in the sincere smiles, the greasy hands, the stories shared in the support group he still attended, no longer out of necessity, but by choice. We gather today, Rose, now an ordained celebrant, began the ceremony, to celebrate not just a union, but a modern miracle, the power of love and loyalty to transform lives. Max barked softly in approval, drawing laughter from the audience. Clara and Andrew, Rose continued, have chosen to write their own vows. Clara took a deep breath, her eyes glistening with restrained tears. Andrew, when we first met, you were a lost man who had found a dog. Or perhaps, as we found out later, a dog who had found a man. You taught me that sometimes we need to lose everything to gain what really matters. That vulnerability is not weakness, but the greatest form of courage. She paused, smiling at Nathan. You didn't just love me, you loved my son as your own. You turned our scars into medals of honor, our pain into purpose. And with Max, you taught us that family isn't something we're born into, but something we choose to build, one day at a time. Andrew blinked several times, fighting back his own tears. Clara, I've spent half my life building walls and the other half hiding behind them. You and Nathan, along with a certain stubborn dog, Max wagged his tail, taught me how to break down those walls, stone by stone. They showed me that true strength lies not in what we can control, but in what we can share. He looked out at the audience, at the faces that had become so important in his life. You gave me more than love, you gave me a community, a purpose, a second chance to be not just a better man, but a real man. And I promise to spend the rest of my life giving that gift back, not just to you and Nathan, but to everyone who, like us, needs to believe in second chances. Rose asked for the rings, which David handed over with slightly trembling hands. As they exchanged them, Max approached, carrying a little surprise on his collar, adoption papers for Nathan. Nathan Moore Carter, Andrew smiled, kneeling down to the boy. If you accept, I'd like to officially be your father, not only in my heart, but also on paper. Nathan looked at his mother, who nodded with tears in her eyes, before throwing herself into Andrew's arms. Finally, he exclaimed, making everyone laugh. By the power vested in me, Rose declared with a beaming smile, and by Max's very enthusiastic approval, I pronounce you husband and wife, and officially a family. The celebration that followed was as diverse as the guests. Executives learned dance moves with neighborhood residents, children ran with rescued dogs, and stories were shared about how a series of unlikely events had transformed an entire community. Later, as the sun began to set, Andrew found a quiet moment with Max. The dog, still wearing his now slightly crooked bow tie, rested his head on his lap. You know, buddy, Andrew murmured, that day in the rain, I thought I was saving you. Little did I know that it was you who was saving me. Clara approached, followed by Nathan, who was carrying a sign, Max Community Veterinary Clinic. Our next adventure, she smiled. A place where other Maxes can find their second chances. Andrew pulled his new family close, watching the sky tinged with soft colors over Boston. The city hadn't changed, but his place in it had. He was no longer a king in his glass tower, but part of something bigger, truer, more real. Max barked softly, as if agreeing with his thoughts. And there, surrounded by his unlikely and perfect family, Andrew Carter finally understood, sometimes the greatest success lies not in what we build for ourselves, but in what we build for others. And sometimes, the greatest love comes with 4 paws, a loyal heart, and the wisdom to know exactly when to show up in a rainy alley.